All right, so welcome again, Sakari. And so
Thank you.
today we would like to talk about climate change education from your perspective, since you are a true expert in the field and you have many applications. We thought you would be the perfect fit to discuss this for our audience at middle school level. So let's start with a really general question. So, like, what is climate change education? So, for you.
Yeah, so climate change education is many things at once, I would say. Of course, it has its roots in environmental education and it has a strong basis on science, but at the same time, it's much more than just science education. Personally, I have a science background, so that's sort of the perspective how I first originally started examining climate change education from chemistry, physics perspective. But the more I've been involved in the field, I've come to realize that it's actually much more about other things than the core science. It's more about values, it's about even emotions, and there's a lot of these other aspects that I think need to be incorporated into climate change education in order for it to be effective. And at the end of the day, climate change is a wicked problem, which means that it's something that's hard to deal with. And that also means that climate change education is hard and it's hard to deal with. That's just the nature of things. But at the same time, I think it's a very important topic. So yeah, glad to share some thoughts about what I've learned and what I think about climate change education broadly.
So, yeah, basically what we can say, it's more than sharing the facts and adding the attitudes, behaviors, and supporting the action for the teachers and students, right? It's
Exactly. And just to sort of double click on that, I would say there's abundant research showing that just increasing students' knowledge on climate change doesn't do much. We need to have them fully involved. And what that practically means is that we discuss values, we discuss maybe some of the hard emotions that might be involved and the attitudes that we have and which our society has. And go through like a critical thinking process. Why do I think this way that I do? Why does our society act the way it does? And so it becomes much more of a social science than a hard science in many regards.
okay. Yeah, that's a really nice point. Yeah. So, like, and in Turkey, like to teach this at a younger age, so we introduced a curriculum called like environmental change and climate change education curriculum. So this curriculum is actually taught at the middle school level, and it has like several types of literacies like water, environmental, like energy literacy. So it's like literacy based curriculum. So like it aims to teach different kinds of literacies at the middle school level. But so like in your idea, like how can we teach, like this is the Turkish perspective, like teaching from a literacy perspective. But what do you think, like why it's important to teach it at the middle school level, and how can we teach it at the middle school level?
Yeah, I look at climate change education more from the competencies perspective. And literacy, of course, is one part of that. But when it comes to competencies, I think we also need to have competencies in, let's say, critical thinking. And that, of course, comes naturally. It doesn't need to come through climate change in per se, but just through our education system at large. Um, and competencies in just, for instance, value discussions and reflection. And that is sort of a part of literature, or sorry, literacy, or it can be, but it's not necessarily embedded in literacy. So that's why I like to look at it maybe more broadly from competencies. And so, how then to embed that into school? That, of course, is the big question that all researchers and teachers are trying to answer. And we have some points of reference in the research literature of what are some of the things we do. At the same time, I think there's not just one solution which will fix the problems, but sort of dwelling into some of the things that we do know. One is first off that we need to allow students to be engaged. So it's not just book knowledge, it's not just classroom time. It's being engaged in the society and in our community and thinking, how can I improve the world around me? And this, of course, is very important, not just from a climate change education perspective, but at large, that students become active citizens. In the school setting, it can mean that they have some projects to discuss, okay, what does our food system look like, and how or what should we maybe do to our food system to change it to make it more sustainable? Or from an energy perspective, how does our energy grid look like? And is there something that we as a school maybe, or we as a community can do to change that to make it more sustainable? And these, of course, all tie into then climate change education as well, because at the end of the day, energy, food, these are the aspects which have a big impact on climate change.
Okay, so look, one of the things that usually teachers do is to introduce some kind of like fear or anxiety to make an awareness. So like, what do you think? Like, how can we start introducing the idea of climate change without creating a like huge fear or anxiety for middle school students?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And maybe I would counter that question by asking, why should we avoid students to have some fear or anxiety, or why us as individuals should we try to avoid all fear and anxiety? At the end of the day, I think our emotions also tell us that we're concerned about something. And in order for things to really change, we do need to be concerned. So there's a lot of literature talking about eco-anxiety and hard emotions that are associated with climate change. And at the same time, it can be very tough for us as individuals, and especially when we're talking about younger students who might have their hands tied in the sense that they're not able to do as much as maybe they would want because they're underage, they can't vote, they can't do a lot of other things. But rather than avoiding eco emotions or eco anxiety, I would encourage teachers to learn of ways that in classrooms with students, they can discuss those emotions. Often emotions are the worst when they're suppressed and you feel that you can't do anything about those emotions or with those emotions. But at its best, emotions can be a very strong driving force. And that actually seems to be the case based on literature, that people who do feel some anxiety and hard emotions towards climate change, they tend to be the most active. So it's associated also with active citizenship, I think. Emotions are part of humans and we're part of society, and it's just a natural part, I think, when dealing with hard issues like climate change, that emotions will emerge.
Okay, perfect. So like just to summarize, like to teach this at the middle school level, so we have to go beyond the knowledge level and we need to know that like they have to take action and it has to go beyond the science classes or the classrooms, right? Like students need to be involved outside the classroom, not just inside the classroom to understand the facts and things related to climate change.
Exactly. I think discussions and reflections are a very important part of climate change education. And also, if the listeners are primarily, let's say, science teachers, I think when it comes to environmental education at large, collaboration between different teachers is very important, because it tends to be the case that no teacher is an expert in dealing with students' emotions, let's say. But at the same time, there's certain subjects that might be more prone or might have some tools to deal with those. So let's say in language, students might write an essay about their emotions or some of the hard feelings that they're facing, if any, and that will give them a room to reflect on those, and it can open some discussions. And then in some other study course, they might engage or think about, like, how do we engage our school or our society? And when teachers work together, and maybe if it's possible to have some school-wide climate change education projects, I think that's where we sort of start getting to the deeper level of climate change education, where it just goes beyond these silos that we tend to often have in schools, that there's science teachers, social science teachers, and so forth.
Okay, so you naturally switched to our next question actually, which was really good because like I would like to discuss how can we teach this in other courses. like usually in Turkey too, like it's a new course and it's an elective course and it's always taught by science teachers. So like people tend to see that this is an aspect linked to science teachers, but like as you said, maybe like organizing school-wide projects, like engaging other disciplines might be a way to integrate at a school level to make sure that other disciplines get involved to understand the climate change.
Hmm. Yeah,
Oh,
and I don't think there's any right answer to
yeah.
that. I think there's two schools of thought. In environmental education, especially, I found that there's researchers who feel that there should be a specific course focusing on certain topics, whereas then there's also the school of thought where they think that it should be integrated into different subjects. And I think both sides have their strengths and weaknesses. And of course, we need to also look at the national curriculum, how it's built, how the school's structured to see which one is actually feasible. We can have an ideal, but can we actually reach that ideal is another question. And so I think it's just most important that we move forward. And if it's just one teacher teaching one course or a part of a course on this topic, I think that's a good start still.
Okay, perfect. So like let's um think that as a starting point, and how can we make sure that teachers and students can think creatively and create critically about climate change? Like, can you give any examples, like sample projects from your expertise or
Yeah, there would be many. Um, but I think, well, creativity and critical thinking, they can go hand in hand, but at the same time, I'm not sure if they tend to be the same aim for the teacher. There might be times when they want to aim for creativity and times when they want to aim for critical thinking. So maybe in my answer, I will lead the creativity side away. I think there's multiple examples of what has been already done in schools and in societies that we don't necessarily need to be creative and create the wheel again in the sense rather than just taking some of those best practices. When it comes to some good practices, I think it's a good way to start that students really understand what are the most impactful things because we don't want to do the things that don't have a big impact. Typically, those are the easiest things. We can start a recycling program. We can remind ourselves to turn off the lights when we leave a room. These are small impact actions that in the big picture, they don't make a difference when it comes to climate change. So we really need to understand what are the big impact actions. As an example, maybe rather than switching off the lights, consider, okay, are we producing renewable energy? Do we have solar panels on our school? And then build a project around that. Okay, can we get our local community involved that they would maybe sponsor solar panels or maybe we can raise some money to be able to get those solar panels for our school, just as one example. Another example also is to look at, because that's a very local perspective, which tend to be quite motivating. But at the same time, I think it's important to get understanding on the global side of things. And the scope of that really depends on the age of the student. So the younger they are, the better it might be to stick to local aspects. But with older students, especially, um, topics that can be discussed and explored are, for instance, carbon trade. Could carbon trade on a national level or a global level be one of the solutions to this problem? What type of feelings does that evoke in me that if I would need to pay more for products, let's say, that have a higher carbon footprint, would I be willing to change my beef to chicken or to tofu if I would need to pay significantly more for that beef because it produces more CO2 emissions? So so I think there's a lot to explore, and also in the literature, there's a lot of different examples of like what things tend to be engaging. But I think just a good starting point is aim to go outside of the school. And actually, just one example does come to mind where creativity is really strongly involved. There's this research article by, her name is Troll, I think, if I recall it correctly, where students went out, they were given cameras and they were asked to photograph their neighborhood. And when they came back, they then reflected on those from like an environmental perspective and especially a climate perspective. What do these things mean for the climate? Like, let's say if there was a high-rise building, you can start reflecting, what would that mean for climate change? Is that the best way to build in a sustainable way and whatnot? So there you can add creativity as well to many of these projects, I think.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, I completely agree that we have to start with considering themselves. So like for instance, like in our case, what we do is like we do ask them to create design projects. So like in every semester, we target a different level of literacy. So for instance, like this semester, it was the environmental literacy. Next semester, we will switch to water literacy. And what we ask them to do is like design something that can help to tackle with challenges of climate change. But we ask them to think about like their environment. So like I'll show you one example, for instance. So this was the project that I liked from last year. So like in this one, like the student had a really simple design idea. Let's assume that like if you will take a shower, like you will have like 100 liters of water. And when you enter the shower, like the light is green when you start. Like at some point it switches to like yellow, then to red, just to warn you that like you are consuming so much water. And so like this was very simple. And
Mm-hmm.
this year's one of the students had an idea about like intelligent plate that we would like to create for her. So like the plate was warning you if you had so much on your plate, like based on like age level and like the food consumption um, that you have. Like she was thinking about creating an app, and if you have more
Mm-hmm.
than on your plate, the plate will warn you, like it'll vibrate and say like you put so much on this plate and you shouldn't eat this much. So like those are really simple things. But if you ask
Mm-hmm.
students to think about like putting themselves in the spotlight, they can do that. But if you say but also like it happens here, like think a design project, like they start taking themselves as mayors of the town, and even the mayor doesn't have the power to change this. So like what we say to
Mm-hmm.
them is just think about yourself, like you have to change, maybe others will follow you, and then we'll see what happens, because we have to go step by step, and it is so hard to make students understand this. And I'd like to ask just a simple question, or a small question here. Like, how can we help this from a system thinking perspective and help students understand that, like, they are part of the system, and how can they get involved in this process to understand
Mm-hmm.
climate change and system thinking?
Yeah. Yeah, those are really cool examples that you shared, and I fully align with that it needs to be from the grassroots up at the same time where it comes from top down. And so that sort of comes to your question as well. And it's not an easy one to answer, even though you said it's just a short question. But systems thinking, I think it's always context driven. So in order for a person to be able to do systems thinking, they need to understand quite a bit about that context. And I don't necessarily think that systems thinking can be directly transferred from one context to another.
Hmm.
So I'm able to do systems thinking in climate change issues, but I'm not necessarily able to do systems thinking in space related issues, let's say. And so knowledge in that case is, of course, key. And it's important to know um, not just the science knowledge, but also quite a bit of psychology, because when it comes to systems and it comes to change, people are involved and people have a mind of their own. And there's different marketing methods that are needed to shift people's minds, and they're never 100% possible. There's politics that are involved and so forth. So just sort of as a general rule, I think when we talk about systems thinking in climate change perspective, it's we have the science, we need general understanding of that, but we have the politics, which is both local and also international. And then we have the individuals. who have a mind of their own, so to speak. So we need some understanding of all of those before we can really understand the system. And I think a really good example where systems thinking wasn't necessarily the strongest suit for humankind is a few years ago, there was a lot of news where the government of, I think it was Netherlands, banned Shell from doing their oil rig project. And all over the news, it was a big celebration, like, yeah, finally this big oil company is gonna go out of business or whatever. But at the same time, if nothing changes on an individual level, nothing's really going to change. I mean, that company can go bankrupt. They can sell those oil rigs to other companies who will still produce that same oil. But as long as the individuals change, nothing's going to change. And so that's where it sort of comes down to this grassroots level and change needed there. But at the same time, I do think we do need those structural changes and support. So it's a two-way street, I think.
Okay, so let's just sum up for teachers. And so like what are the things that like we talked about, like very little but really important details, like what teachers should be mindful for when addressing climate change in their classrooms, like, and what are the things that you see like as mistakes or like things to avoid when addressing this at the school level?
Yeah. I think one of the big mistakes that I see is age appropriateness is missing.
Mm.
And so I have students who go to schools and do projects on climate change issues. And I see this also with other teachers in other countries. And regardless the fact that we tell them that, let's say, recycling is not that big of a deal when it comes to climate change in specific, it's something that teachers just like to deal with because it's so easy. You can talk about recycling if students are in kindergarten, if they're in grade 1 or grade 5 or grade 8 or grade 10, like it's a topic that you can deal with. But at the same time, we need to remember that a lot of the students, at least let's say in Finland, already when they're like 5 or 6 years old, they already know how to recycle. So what's the point of having recycling program projects in school when they're in like grade 8 or grade 9? Like we need to move forward and we need to understand what our students already know. Whether they do it or not, that's a different issue because there's infrastructure related to it. Like, is it easy to recycle and so forth? But if they know like how to recycle and so forth, then it's sort of time to move forward. And sort of taking that same principle to all education, I think we just need to be aware of where our students are at and really try to build projects which it's sort of challenging for them to deal with because they always need a certain level of challenge. If it's too easy, it's not worth doing. So challenging them to take sort of go beyond maybe their comfort zone, of course, not too far, but still a little bit beyond that. I think that's sort of when we're in the most fruitful area when it comes to learning as well.
Okay, so just to summarize the critical keywords that you said, like we have to make students responsible, so they need to take action.
Mm,
We have to give them wicked problems that are not too hard, but that'll push them out of the comfort zone that they are currently in. So like those are
mhm.
maybe the critical keywords that we need to have for teachers to make it sure that like it's somewhat effective for the students or it will push students to take some action. And like one final question, like, and how can we make sure that students learn this? Like, how can we assess this at the end? Like we have design projects, other kinds of projects, and how can the teachers understand that students are now better at climate change?
Mhm. Assessment is always hard. In some countries, it's harder than others, and I'm not sure how it works in Turkey. But I think the traditional way of assessment when it comes to these issues just isn't viable, and we need to have other assessment ways. Whether the curriculum allows for that, that's another question. It's sort of country specific. But again, sort of stepping into the ideal, the teacher needs to follow the process. And the process is something that teachers could and should assess. How is the student learning along the process? And it's not even about learning just some quantitative data that we can ask in a exam, like do they know how much CO2 emissions are emitted in Turkey? That's almost irrelevant compared to the process that they're learning how to engage others, engaging themselves, and challenging themselves, stepping beyond their comfort zone. Those are all things that I think are very valuable. And as a teacher, we can observe those. And of course, it also depends how well we know the students, how much we're engaged with them in general. But ideally, those are some of the things that we would be following. And also, what comes to then assessment, also this assessment would be giving feedback, not through giving a grade on an exam, but seeing those developments that are happening in individuals and talking to them and saying, hey, I noticed that you are really pushing yourself in these things, and because of that, you achieve this and that. And that type of assessment and feedback can really encourage the individuals, but at the same time, it shows that the teacher is actually observing what the students are doing and seeing their progress. Now, of course, that does not fit into a lot of the national curricular at this stage. And one of the issues that we have even in Finland, where our assessment is maybe one of the leanest in the world, we don't have annual exams and whatnot. But even in Finland, sometimes we get pushback from students and teachers like, okay, why do we need to do this? Like, is this going to be a part of our grade? So in Finland, teachers can work their way around it and can actually make it part of their grade because they're assessing the process. But at the same time, there are creative ways that you can ask also in exams, more essay type of questions where they need to, let's say, explain a process or whatnot, which you can give them some points for, like if you're sort of tied to the general assessment way that, okay, there's a curriculum and there's going to be an exam and the exam grade is what we need to use for assessment. Maybe there's ways to still implement these things there.
And what we do, like beyond the things that you, in addition to the things that you said, what we do here is we are trying to create a rewarding system, because like there's a national design competition every year. Like we select a couple of kids, so like from each school, we make them meet with designers at the university level. We select a couple of design projects and send them to national design projects. Like, and when they know that there's a reward, so like, that's how we try to push it here, because like that's the first question that you hear. Why are we doing this? Like if you're
Yeah,
11-year-old, that's a really nice question to, like, because they want to know why suddenly they're thinking about climate change when they were not thinking about yesterday. So why do you want them to think about this suddenly? So like that,
exactly.
yeah, that's one of the things too. All right, is there anything that you want to add? I think it was a really nice discussion, by the way.
Yeah, it's been, you have great questions. Nothing's on the top of my mind to add. Of course, there's many rabbit holes to go
Yeah.
down, but maybe it's better to leave it at this.
Okay.